If I asked you to list some of the most influential directors in post-Paramount Decision Hollywood through the end of the 1960s, odds are the master of suspense, Alfred J. Hitchcock, would be on that list. His thrillers, like Vertigo and Rear Window, define this era as one evolving away from the cookie-cutter studio unit system and into an independent package unit system. Independently produced in 1962 and released in 1963, The Birds is a prime hallmark of this era. However, this movie is much debated because of its combination of both the mature, traditional Hollywood and burgeoning artistic cinematic elements. In the end, defining this mix as Hitchcock's own. The Birds is an indictment of the move towards auteurism in post-decision Hollywood, through Hitchcock's dialogue between different historically significant styles at the time in which it was made, as well as influence from his previous experience and works by his colleagues. Furthermore, this also results in an indictment of auteur theory itself and the active attempt by Hitchcock and other filmmakers to redefine thrillers as an art form. Unlike some of his other films, the first 30 minutes are spent with exposition and follow traditional Hollywood causal narrative, which ends in this drawn-out scene with our assumed protagonist driving a boat across Bodega Bay. The Birds is Tippi Hedren's debut feature, and as a result, it is unlike Hitchcock's other movies using well-known actors and actresses. Hitchcock was faced with the challenge of making the audience identify with a relatively unknown actress. As Robert Capps has said in an article on Hitchcock building his own reputation. For this, Hitchcock used his own experience with German Expressionism from earlier in his career. By using high contrasting shots and subjective angles through which the audience becomes accustomed to the main character and begins to empathize, a critical element in the character of Hitchcock's film begins to form. By the time she's in the boat halfway across the bay, through to the time she returns to the dock, the camera continually switches from close-ups and medium shots of Melanie as she gazes at the scenery to a subjective lens where we are shown what it is she is looking at. Thus, Hitchcock builds a similar awkward tension as in the Gothic novel the movie was based on, and utilizes Melanie as a surrogate for the audience. Hitchcock's experience of German Expressionism, like that of Friedrich Murnau's The Last Laugh in 1924, uses a similar style of highly contrasting shots and a subjective lens to encourage identification and empathy. The only break with the subjective viewpoint is the brief shot of the seagull before and after the attack. Immediately as the bird hits Melanie in the boat, we cut away from shots with a purely subjective expressionist view, as if we have entered a world outside our own. Before, plot events seem to happen in a clearly anticipated order, but a good portion of the chain of cause and effect that typically governs narration in the Hollywood cinema disintegrates after the first 30 minutes. The causal nature of those 30 minutes introduces a normality that as a result of the bird attack and events following it is turned on its head. This changes the film from a novel, screwball romantic comedy into a dark poem in the remainder of the film. Hitchcock decided not to use a traditional film score, but instead opted to utilize electronic sound to enhance the bird's noises, a choice not normally used in a Hollywood production at the time. By using the sound of really magnetic tapes to mimic bird noises, and solely diegetic uses of music and the sound in the rest of the film, it further adds to the artificial realism this film seems to imitate. The Birds then appears as incipiently modernist, a work that stages the potential end of narrative cinema itself. In this context, the electronic soundtrack may be understood for its thematic and diegetic resonances that render bird noises machine-like and vice versa. Even Francois Truffaut mentioned in an interview with Hitchcock that essentially the sound of the birds act as the soundtrack for the film, where music might set the mood. These aesthetic decisions are in direct dialogue with New Wave aesthetics, namely the French New Wave and the current art cinema of the 1960s, in how it presents film as a construction. After the first bird attack, the plot discontinues the clear motivation or logic preceding it. Many shots, including that of the pecked-out farmer's eyes, repeated, creates a jarring effect that exposes the film for what it is, a fabrication. By using individual shots, selective uses of soundtrack, and even the artificial eau de Nil green dress Melanie wears for the majority of the film, the audience suspends the logic and standard perceptions of reality commonly assumed to be true in the film world. In that sense, through the use of New Wave cinema, Hitchcock cultivated the feeling that the world had spun off its moral axis, that the end was near and could come without warning or reason. Keep in mind, historically, the impact of the Cold War, not to mention nuclear testing and the terrors of the Cuban Missile Crisis 5 months earlier. Science fiction was filled with mutant animals, and without going that far, Hitchcock happened to tap into that underlying storyline. Many of his great works tap into a fear or anxiety, and most of his thrillers tap into the fear of losing control. By the time of The Bird's release, looking to the skies for unknown terrors was just as present as when the book came out almost a decade earlier. Still, many at the time criticized The Birds as underwhelming, too colorful for a thriller and not scary enough. They cited that Hitchcock has grown old and tired in his ways, serving only as a method for a cheap scare with little reward.
No.
A few reviews attempt to make sense of the world created by assigning the same Oedipus complex in many academic responses to his previous work, Psycho.
With all due respect to Oedipus, I don't think that was the case.
The search for answers lead other audience members like New York Times reviewer Bosley Crowther to think Hitchcock meant The Birds to represent the classical furies that were supposed to pursue the wicked on this earth.
Any woman who would give Mitch the one thing Lydia can give him, love.
If it is true that Alfred J. Hitchcock is the master of suspense, then, as Mary Corlass puts it, he ransacked all of cinema's resources to do it. The drama created by his auteurist vision, by utilizing these styles and current fears and making them his own, is what made him great, and his willingness to commit this crime against traditional Hollywood film is the reason we study him and his works to this day.